Welcome everyone to the library. I'm Lisa Weilbacker, Director of the Columbia County Historical Society, and we're thrilled to partner with the African American Archives of Columbia County for this lecture series. And I would like to proceed to introduce Leigh Fludd-Smith, Deputy Executive Director of the African American Archive of Columbia County. Leigh is a researcher and lay historian who focuses on combining abstract data with social, historical, cultural observation. She is descended from Black families who have lived in Columbia County for over 250 years and is presently writing a book on the history of slavery and freedom in the area. In addition to her work with the archive, Lisa also owns a furniture restoration business in Westchester County, where she lives with her family. Please welcome Leigh.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to see all of you here and to welcome all of you who are joining us on Zoom. I hear there are a lot of people joining us on Zoom, so that's a good thing, and we're really happy that everyone could come out today and join us. So as Lisa said, I am the Deputy Executive Director of the African American Archive of Columbia County. The archive exists to document, preserve, and share the deep history of Black families in Columbia County. We are a fledgling organization. We've only been around for a little over a year, and we are working very hard to grow our collection and gather as much of the historical information of the area as we can. So that being said, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Her name is Dr. Myra Armstead. Dr. Armstead is Vice President for Academic Inclusive Excellence and the Lyford, Paterson Edwards, and Helen Gray Edwards Professor of Historical Studies at Bard College. Dr. Armstead received her doctorate in history from the University of Chicago with concentrations in U.S. urban history, U.S. diplomatic history, African American history. She holds a master's degree in international relations with the concentration in African affairs and a bachelor's degree in government from Cornell University. Professor Armstead's books include Lord, Please Don't Take Me in August, African Americans in Newport and Saratoga Springs, 1870 to 1930. Mighty Change, Tall Within, Black Identity in the Hudson Valley. And Freedom's Gardener, James F. Brown, Horticulture and the Hudson Valley in Antebellum America. We're looking forward to Dr. Armstead's newest work, Memory and Enslavement, the Schuyler House and Old Saratoga, the Saratoga Patent, in History, Historical Practice, and Historical Imagination, which should be published later on this spring. Currently, Dr. Armstead is completing two research projects. One, a book-length study, of cultural reforms in public historical practice in New York and the nation during the Progressive era, and a study of class divisions and cross-class connections regarding economic issues among the evangelical Protestants in North America. In 2014-2015, she received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to undertake research at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture. And her study of economics and religion was supported by a 3-year grant from the Louisville Institute. So Dr. Armstead knows a lot about the subject we're talking about today. And without further ado, welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction and for just the introduction, the opportunity to talk about what I'm going to talk about. And I didn't plan this, but when I heard the introduction of you, it just put me in mind on of this little autobiographical excerpt. I'm excited that you're doing this history. This is a wonderful moment for me to be living and practicing history. I said this to Bill Jeffway as we were having lunch right before this talk. I grew up in the Borscht Belt when it was the Borscht Belt. And it was a very wonderful place to grow up, very, very progressive, excellent public schools, that exceeded state standards, unbelievable today if you went to the Borscht, but it was a wonderful place to grow up. And I remember in 6th grade reading a book that I found in the library, the school library. And today it would be a C- book, but I was thrilled with it. It was a kind of romance. It was about a young girl in the late 19th century who grew up in rural Illinois, Southern Illinois. She was an orphan, and she was raised by some very kind relatives, I think an aunt and an uncle, on a farm. When she turned 18, she decided that she had taken enough from them. They did not want her to leave, but she felt that she owed it to them to leave. And she decided to go to Chicago, and there became a department store clerk, and met and fell in love with the department store son's owner, the owner's son. And that was the book. And I remember being thrilled with this book. There was a very strict lights out policy in our house, 8 o'clock, had to be in bed, lights out. I waited till my parents fell asleep, and I turned the light on to finish this book. And I was so thrilled with it. Like at 1 o'clock in the morning, I clasped it to me, and I just thought, oh, what would it be like to be this wonderful girl? And almost immediately, the thought entered my head, wait a minute, that wouldn't be your life, and no one was, where that came from was just, obviously intuition and some kind of inchoate observation of the world. And I remember for a few minutes combing my memory banks and trying to figure out what I knew from social studies. And I knew that I couldn't find anything. And I just hit a wall. And I remember just closing that file. Fast forward decades, and I'm in my maybe my 3rd year at Bard, and I'm teaching. And I taught courses in women's history. I taught courses in labor history and urban history and African American history, all the social history topics that you can think of. And somehow or another that day, I was talking about the rise of the department store in the late 19th century, the reasons for it, who it appealed to. And it suddenly hit me as I was talking to the students, oh, I know how to answer that question that I had in 6th grade. And I feel that with this sort of explosion of interest in slavery in the North and in the Hudson Valley, and now in Columbia County, the questions that boys and girls and adults have about that part of the past that were never told are now being told. So I hadn't planned on saying that, but I was just really gratified to hear that story. The subject of my talk is very broad. The book that was mentioned covers quite a bit. There's no way I can go into it in depth. And then I looked at the flyer advertising the talk, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything. So just let me tell you that in order to get a digestible handle on this, the sections of the book that I'm going to be talking about will be taken. They're going to be taken from the book that Leigh mentioned. I do want to give credit to the National Park Service for asking me to do the book. This is part of a collaboration that they have with the Organization of American Historians. And in this case, it was particularly on the subject of slavery and slaveholding on the grounds of the Saratoga National Historic Site between 1684 and 1837. So I'll mainly be talking about slavery. And like in the last few minutes, I'll say a few things about freedom, and maybe that will spark some questions. Okay, so the area that I'm talking about is part of what was known as a Saratoga patent. And you can ask later about what a patent was. But in 1684, this patent was granted. It was land amounting to about 150,000 acres from the Mohawk people. And I would say presumptuously given to 7 Anglo-Dutch settler families. And I noted that in this series, you're going to have Rachel Maskill come, Nicole come. And she, I've assigned some of my students her dissertation, so I was delighted to see her book. But I like to point out, I have a phrase for summing up what she does for these northern families. But in the Hudson Valley, I call them an interlocking directorate because they intermarried all the time. And you really see this on the patent. You can't really make out the names, but there are a lot of Livingstons, Bleekers, Tenbrooks, Van Dykes, and Schuyler's. Those are the main people in this particular patent. So as you can see, it's on both sides of the Hudson River. And Schuyler's property that I will mainly be talking about is way at the top on the western end, near the river. The old divided lands, you can't make that out, but just trust me. And but the two plots just south of the top border, nearest the river, okay? But he had land further south and on the other side of the river, which is Washington County. And at the very top on the western side of the river, I should mention, is present-day Schuylerville, which was recently in the news. During this period, it was known as Saratoga. That was Saratoga, and all of this was part of Albany County. Saratoga hadn't been formed yet. That doesn't happen until 1791, and this is about 30 miles north of Albany. So Schuyler is probably the most noted of the patentees here. This is a picture of the patent in relationship to Saratoga County. So you can see Saratoga Springs, it's 10 miles west. And just remember, the patent does extend over into Washington County. So this is Philip Schuyler. You can get a sense of the span of his life. And I'll be talking about the mid to late 18th century. And I want to go back. So here's the park. And the park owes its status as a National Historic Site to the fact that it is the site of the battles of Saratoga. Everybody remember those from like 4th grade or something? The turning point of the Revolution. And also because of Saratoga House. Just curious, has anybody gone to Saratoga House? It's I think celebrated by park staff and, and others. But this building, which was Schuyler's country seat, was burned down during the Battle of Saratoga to the ground. He had a city estate known as the Pastures or Saratoga Mansion, and that still is there in Albany. But this was rebuilt within less than 2 months as Saratoga House. That we can talk about later. And so this sort of stands as a kind of icon to American and patriot resilience, that, they were struck down and they stopped the onslaught of the British and, began the slow turning of the tide towards victory. So, in other words, the site is commemorated generally for its contribution to national glory. In my work, I focused on the grim underbelly of America's founding at that site by uncovering the story of the enslaved people on the patent, and especially those held by the general. I do talk about others as well. On average, Schuyler held a dozen or 13 enslaved people. And that was fairly typical of people of his stature. 12, 14, Van Rensselaer at one point had more than that, but that was fairly typical. I argue that the upper Hudson Valley, the entire valley, was in fact a slave society because of its dependence on slaves. So let me explain what I mean. I don't know if this has been discussed by some of the other speakers you've had in this series, but historians have long acknowledged the reliance on enslaved labor in the greater Hudson Valley on the large estates that were created from land grants like this patent that were made during the colonial period. But because slave historiography has focused almost exclusively on the South, where the overwhelming majority of enslaved people in the country resided, scholars for most of the 20th century simply noted the extent of slaveholding in this region of the North as exceptional. And certainly that's what I was taught when I was a graduate school, that there were two areas in the North that were very reliant on slaves, where there was a concentration of slaves. It was the Hudson Valley and the Narragansett Bay of Rhode Island. And that, this was exceptional. It was noted, and that was it. But in the 1990s, academic publications by historians Graham Hodges and Ira Berlin brought attention to the realities of Black human bondage in New York and the North. But these works implicitly or explicitly confirmed that New York, both as a colony and an early antebellum state, was best categorized as a society with slaves. So Berlin makes this distinction: slave society and society with slaves, and says that New York, all of New York, was society with slaves. The reigning paradigm, in other words, for a long while, blunted a full recognition that the Hudson Valley, I would argue, from Manhattan to Albany and the surrounding areas, was in fact a slave society with heavy reliance on involuntary Black labor. Recent studies like Christie Clark Pujara's dark work, The Business of Slavery in Rhode Island, have carefully documented the existence of slave societies in Northeastern America, particularly in New England, in part by measuring the engagement of selected populations in the state working in maritime trades in cotton. So they were either sailors involved in trade with cotton or in the textile mills that produced cotton cloth. Berlin himself even argued that the first generations of colonial American settlement during the 17th century, which he labeled the charter generations, that during this time, the great estates of the Hudson Valley, and these are his words, depended on slave labor. The importance of enslaved labor only increased in the region over the next 100 years. Again, Berlin wrote, and this is a quote, "The growth of slavery in the mid-18th century was even more profound in the Hudson River Valley," end quote. Now, he probably believed this part of New York fell short of being a full-fledged slave society because of the absence of certain other criteria he outlines. There were rarely slave quarters, the rows of small cabins in which the enslaved lived at a distance from the slave owner's residence on a plantation. Enslaved laborers were not generally organized into gangs as work units. They grew no single staple crop. The number of enslaved people per enslaver in the valley compared to the South was relatively small, although we can talk about that later because throughout the antebellum period, the overwhelming majority of Southerners, white Southerners, did not own slaves. We can talk about the distribution of slaveholding in the South. But when the Hudson Valley's large landowners' dependence on enslaved laborers, to which Berlin does admit, is combined with his other political and economic indices for such societies, the Hudson River Valley most definitely was a slave society. Berlin refers to the slaveholders', quote, control of the state and, quote, seizure of power, presumably over non-slaveholding rural families in slave societies. While he is not explicit in describing these terms or processes, we can deduce from other portions of his argument that he is referring to enslavers' ability to enact laws supporting the existence of slavery and its vise-like restrictions on nearly every aspect of the lives of those they enslaved. Yet, political power in the Hudson Valley was more equally distributed than early 20th century historians concluded. It was not as concentrated in the hands of elites, large landholders, as once believed. Later and recent studies of electoral participation in colonial and late 18th century America suggest relatively wide access to the vote by adult white males over the age of 21, including even lesser property owners without slaves. Tenant farmers in New York and the big slave owners like Schuyler had tenants, for example, could vote if they held the typically long lifetime leases that Valley landlords like the Schuylers preferred. These were like 99 years and more. It therefore seems that a legislative monopoly on the part of slaveholders, of big slaveholders, was not necessary in the Hudson Valley for the provincial assembly, which was an exclusively white electorate, to permit the passage of slave codes that define the control and power Berlin references in slave societies. The simple white majority from all ranks favored such policies. Moreover, the Hudson River Valley produced another of his criteria, and that was a, quote, saleable commodity. Now, this wasn't a single commodity. In this case, it was food provisions for the West Indies and lumber. In fact, the areas of today's New York State Capital District along the upper Hudson River quickly became slave societies, relying on Black workers as essential human capital in the production of food provisions. The regular use of African enslaved people began within 2 years of the establishment of New York as a colony by the Dutch West India Company in 1624. Since the Dutch patroon system of land distribution, which was granting huge tracts to a few privileged recipients, had the effect of discouraging European immigration to New Amsterdam at first, the company turned to chattel slavery as a source of labor to develop the colony's infrastructure and wealth, to clear forests, to make roads, to construct docks, to farm, to perform skilled labor. European settlers used slaves as private servants as well. In the late 17th and early 18th century, as the Hudson River Valley's fur trade declined because of source depletion, white colonists turned to more diversified economic pursuits after British rule was established in 1664. Large landholders increasingly relied on enslaved labor as farmhands, domestic servants, and skilled workers tied to the new livestock and food provisioning services offered by the region for the monocrop sugar-producing colonies of the British West Indies. By 1720, New York ranked fourth among the 13 colonies behind South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland in Black population, the overwhelming majority of whom were enslaved, caught in the web of multiple triangular trade routes involving Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and North America. The Schuyler family's oversight of Saratoga patent lands epitomized these dynamics of New World capitalism in New York Province as household heads forced enslaved labor there to help produce, transport, and process goods as part of the general use of slaves in marketing activities for both their own and their tenants' farm output. In this, the Schuylers replicated other patent owners. In the Hudson River Valley, these included downstate landowners like the Phillipses of Phillips Manor, a 90,000-acre Westchester County plantation that once claimed 23 enslaved people, the Van Cortlands of Cortland Manor in the Bronx, a site with as many as 17 Black forced workers, mid-upper regional gentry like the Livingstons of Livingston Manor of Columbia County, on which 44 enslaved people once labored at an ironworks, and other capital district elites like the Van Rensselaers of Rensselaer's Wick, a parcel of over 1 million acres where 15 enslaved humans lived in 1790. Now, I did want to say about that 44, that's a huge number, even by Southern standards. All the families attached to these highly lucrative properties were involved in slave trafficking domestically and or internationally as well. So they used slaves, and they also were involved in the transatlantic slave trade and the Caribbean, North American slave trade. Now, you may, okay, let me just stop here. So I started doing this research in 2019, and it was very painstaking because then it was slowed by the pandemic. And using available sources, I was able to compile a list of all of the people who were enslaved by the Schuylers. It was almost impossible to say who was enslaved in the mansion as opposed to the estate because he moved them around. So I just put them all together. And one of the things that you should immediately note is that there were typically twice as many men as there were women. And, we can talk about that later. So, and these names, by the way, they came from the Schuyler papers. They would just sort of be mentioned here and there. Okay, now this is the Holy Grail for anybody doing history of enslavement in the Hudson Valley. And I first discovered this 20 years ago. And, it's been my delight to see, the way in which it's been referred to. And it's as if, I like to say, as if God himself said, I'm going to leave a record no matter what people say, there was slavery. So this is a wonderful piece of evidence. This is called an overmantel because it hung over a fireplace in the home of John Heaton in Leeds, just across, where are we? Hudson, yeah, just, past Catskill. And it was painted by John Heaton. It's attributed to him. Other paintings from the area in like style seem to have been done by him. So sometime in the 1730s, this was a working farm that the Van Bergens operated. And this would be a modest operation. And, there are several things that I call attention to in the actual piece. First of all, you see this manicured land. It's, flat, it's been cleared. That should not be taken for granted. Somebody had to do that. And I didn't do it for this presentation, but to really understand this as a historical document, you need to see details, little slices of it. But I'll just point out that this is an enslaved woman with a turban. She's going towards the cows. This is another enslaved woman, clearly, if you could see it, with a milk bucket going towards the cows. Let's see, where is there? There are 2 Native Americans. There are working class, or what we would call working class, for unpropertied whites. Here are the 2 owners, their children. You can see a distinction in their dress, can barely make it out. And then over here is a man with an axe in his hand, and he's headed towards the woodshed or the woods. Obviously, this is supposed to be a very harmonious, happy setting. The horses are jumping and rollicking, and then we have the beautiful Catskill Mountains in the distance. So, you know, John Heaton was just painting what he saw, you know, and this evidence is sort of entrees. Somebody wants to be admitted. I'm letting him in. Okay.
You don't have to worry about those.
Okay, all right. And so I began with that to start to describe some of the occupations of these slaves. Economic historian Gavin Wright summarized the range of agricultural tasks performed by enslaved populations on large properties devoted to diversified farming, like the Schuyler's. And he did this by reviewing colonial and antebellum diaries of mixed crop farmers. In other words, people who weren't doing staple crops, rice, cotton, sugar. So this is a long quote, but it's a good one because it really does capture the variety of work. So I'm going to read it. Slaves' work included laying off new fields, removing stones from the fields and hauling them away, cutting trees and hauling wood to town, to the railroad depot later in the antebellum period, or to sawmills, harrowing, scraping manure from barnyards, hauling, plowing, and spreading gypsum and manure, sewing, constructing, and maintaining log and stone fences, to keep cattle out of the fields, harvesting and threshing wheat, cleaning, sowing, threshing, and hulling clover that was used to replenish nitrogen in the wheat fields, stacking wheat, repairing wheat stacks, cleaning and screening wheat, hauling wheat to the mill, hauling wheat straw, fodder and chaff, burning straw and chaff, preparing seed wheat, cutting clover grown in the wheat fields after harvest, and foddering the cattle. Once these chores were done, slaves did not rest. There was coal to haul, ice to cut and load, beef and mutton to salt, and corn to plant, thin, or shell. Other slave tasks included bringing loads of gypsum or buckwheat, shucking corn, pounding hominy, planting and tending gardens, digging out hotbeds, planting and digging potatoes, patching bags, making shingles, making butter and cheese, burying cabbage or beets, repairing cisterns, shearing sheep, I'm almost done, tending livestock, greasing and oiling harnesses, working on roads, making currant wine, mowing, cutting oaks, and working on neighboring wheat farms if one's master lent or hired out his labor force to a neighbor. And then Berlin comes up with a similar description of the Hudson Valley. It's not as long. And he says that on rural farms, they sowed in the spring, reaped in the fall, and slack time slaves manured the land, chopped wood, broke flax, pressed cider, repaired fences, cleared fields, and prepared new lands for cultivation. They played an especially large role in carrying trade as boatmen and wagoners, piloting boats, delivering a message. I'm really cutting this out. Smithing horses, tanning leather. Men and women who worked in the fields were assigned to domestic tasks as servants and gardeners, although the sexual division of labor grew more pronounced with the rise of agricultural wealth. The division between house and field remained open and ill-defined. The sources for this list, diaries, letters, but for me, the memoirs that existed and reading against the grain. In other words, not necessarily taking at word the descriptions of the enslaved people and pushing beyond what the text tells us. And you can ask me about examples of that later, as well as paintings. Visual evidence was very, very important for me. And, you know, that's a complex issue, which I can talk about further. So about Philip, he inherited, the Schuylers were on this patent in 3 periods. There was a period from about 1702 to 1745. And that was when this area was the most insecure. It was borderland, and in 1745, in fact, the Philip Schuyler, I mean, there are Philip Schuylers everywhere, but that particular Philip Schuyler, who was occupying the land as a pioneer settlement, gets killed during one of the French and Indian Wars. So the house and the property are completely destroyed. In 1763, when the French and Indian Wars are completely over, then his heir, his nephew, the Philip that is famous from Hamilton and, you know, Revolutionary War exploits, took over. And he was very successful in building up sawmills and lumber mills and fisheries and, you know, all kinds of industries. He became an extremely wealthy man until the Battle of Saratoga. And then, as I said, within 7 weeks, he rebuilt the house and extended it a couple of times to sort of proclaim on the landscape his stature. This was fairly common. And that continued until his death in 1804. And his heirs took over. I can answer questions about that. The tremendous financial success of Philip Schuyler's ventures before the Revolution were in consequence of his shrewdness. He gave his laborers, enslaved as well as free, some opportunity to improve their lives. And we see this through a ledger, which I can talk about in the Q&A. I want to end sort of suggestively, here we go again. All right, with this painting, which is on the cover of the book. Has anybody seen this before? Okay, all right. So this is by Emanuel Gottlieb Lutze. It's called Mrs. Schuyler Burning Her Wheat Fields on the Approach of the British. It was painted in 1872. So one wonders, I obviously chose this because of the inclusiveness of the figures and this enslaved boy. So one wonders how the Black captives reacted when they watched Philip's wife, Catherine, order the burning of the family's wheat fields in anticipation of British General Burgoyne's 1777 advance to Saratoga during the Revolutionary War, as her husband instructed. Schuyler's most scholarly biographer, Don Gerlach, doubts this ever occurred. There's no evidence in the general's correspondence that his wife destroyed crops or that he gave such orders. But suppose we look to other possible evidence. The narratives that swell this event may not have been apocryphal. Catherine Schuyler Baxter, the granddaughter of Catherine Katie Schuyler, General Schuyler's youngest daughter, related the theatrical episode in her nationalistic family history by quoting Katie's supposed 1846 account, as well as that of Civil War General John White's De Peyster, who wrote many accounts of the Battle of Saratoga. Now, it's true that Katie was not yet born at the time of the supposed event, and it's true that Schuyler had been relieved of his high military post after the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. He was court-martialed and eventually exonerated. He was exonerated. So she may have had a personal interest in burnishing her great-grandfather's name to undo any lingering damage to his honor after this public humiliation. But these considerations do not automatically invalidate her story. There is significant documentation of British predations against colonists' food stores, stealing them for the Crown's troops during the Revolutionary War. For instance, the Schuylers would have known about the British seizure of wheat, oat, and corn in April 1777 during the Redcoats' raid on Danbury, Connecticut, despite the resistance of a force led by Benedict Arnold, who later assisted the Continental Army in the battles of Saratoga. From nearby Fairfield, Mrs. Mary Silliman, wife of the officer heading the local Connecticut militia, General Gold-Selleck Silliman, had watched closely and recorded the event in her journal. Philip and Catherine Schuyler would not have wanted a repeat occurrence at Saratoga from their ample supplies. More to the point for this project, though, is not so much the literal historicity of the wheat burning as the meaning to be drawn from Mrs. Schuyler's purported action, what the memorialized story signified, and the reasons to interrogate that message for clues about African-American experiences. In 19th century publications, besides Catherine Schuyler's, Mrs. Schuyler is ennobled for blocking, eluding British Army's access to her family's vast food supply. She's venerated for this act, which displayed Philip's, quote, confidence in her spirit, firmness, and patriotism. The dramatic memory of the Schuylers' self-sacrificing nationalism was further established by the visual record in this painting, which was also incorporated into the Saratoga Monument, standing today within the Saratoga National Historical Park. The monument, which is an obelisk, a granite obelisk, was completed in 1887 and dedicated in 1912. But it was first proposed in 1856 by the newly formed Saratoga Monument Association to commemorate the battles of 1777. In fact, both Loitz's painting and the monument were part of the contribution of American artists to the process of antebellum national self-creation, the development of a national identity based on a common political culture. After the divisive convulsions of the Civil War, however, that process became reconciliatory, proclaiming national healing and pride. Within the politically fractious decade before the war, in other words, the 1850s, Loitz's original painting both recalls and ensconces a public memory of the torched wheat fields as a unifying event. Folded into the Saratoga Monument as a reproduction in the immediate post-war Reconstruction period, the painting interprets the Schuylers as leaders of a public that is consenting and like-minded in their devotion to the struggle for independence. A barefoot enslaved young man wearing a disheveled shirt crouches next to Mrs. Schuyler as he dutifully reaches to supply her with a lit candle. She looms above him holding a torch she is putting to the grain. Both enslaver and enslaved are dressed in muted shades of red, white, and/or blue, suggesting the pair's patriotic union of mind and purpose. Mrs. Schuyler stands at the center of an ideal, imagined national community of Black and white, female and male, young and adult, rich and poor. Significantly, it is the enslaved boy who has the most direct access to the flame, but his use of it is mitigated. It is the candle in his lantern that supplies the fire to the torches used by Mrs. Schuyler and the older of two white girls, perhaps intended to reference a Schuyler daughter. While he has the potential of ignition, he does not use it. He does not set anything afire himself. Instead, the slave, in a crouching position and lowest to the ground of all the figures, is guided by a white man, probably representing one of the general's overseers at Saratoga. Directive power rests with him. In this way, Loitz visually affirmed Black subservience to supervision by whites, which was a comforting image for them, particularly regarding the use of fire by enslaved people. Fire was universally feared by enslavers as a ready tool for protest in the hands of those they enslaved. Indeed, enslaved people used this weapon of vengeance in numerous instances throughout the Atlantic world, from Brazil to the Caribbean and North America. Anxieties about violent slave resistance swelled in North America on the heels of the 1791 Haitian Revolution, leading whites to increase their surveillance of enslaved people. In Albany, for instance, a fire set by 3 slaves in November 1793 resulted in the destruction of 26 buildings and prompted legislation restricting the free movement of enslaved people in the city. In contrast, Lurtz's painting works to allay fears of Black insurrection and instead aligns those in bondage with a different revolution, the American Democratic Revolution. The canvas memorializes a compliant, submissive servant taking orders from his enslaver's agent, thus folding slave acquiescence into the nation's revolutionary founding. So I'm going to stop there and not talk about a lot of other things, but I hope that I've sort of sparked some interest and will answer those questions as they come.
Interesting. And I love what you talked about with the paintings, because I've seen that painting a million times and not seen all of that in it. So
Yeah.
thank you. I do have a question about, before I go to everybody else, I have a question about one of the slides you had with the names of the enslaved people on Schuyler in their home. Would they have, that was a lot of people. So over like what kind of time period, like how many would they have had at a time?
They would have had about a dozen between the 2 sites, the mansion and the estate. So those are the names that turned up between 1763-ish and 1804.
Interesting. And I love what you talked about with the paintings, because I've seen that painting a million times and not seen all of that in it. So thank you. I do have a question about, before I go to everybody else, I have a question about one of the slides you had with the names of the enslaved people on Schuyler in their home. Would they have, that was a lot of people. So over like what kind of time period, like how many would they have had at a time?
They would have had about a dozen between the 2 sites, the mansion and the estate. So those are the names that turned up between 1763-ish and 1804.
Yes.
I came from Albany for this presentation. I was wondering when you last toured the Schuyler Mansion in Albany.
That
presentation has changed a lot.
Oh yeah, well, I went.
Can
Oh,
I just repeat it for this?
I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. The question for those of you following along at home is when Dr. Armstead last went to the Schuyler Mansion.
Okay. I was last at the Schuyler Mansion before the pandemic in 2019, and they already had a monitor up. I know Heidi Hill, and actually it was I work well with the NPS staff, and I think they are trying very hard to improve, their understanding of their interpretation.
The one in Albany or in Sarasota?
Both.
Because Albany is New York State, it's not.
That's right. I do know that. Yeah. But both of them, I think, are working hard. It's difficult. I mean, even and I think they're open. In Saratoga, they had even done some work on descendant communities that they didn't quite know what to do with. And, Heidi knows where the records are, et cetera, that she makes them available. As I said, in that site, all I saw, but it was good, was the monitor, the freestanding monitor where you can push the button and you see prints. And then on their website, there are a couple of enslaved people whose lives they've traced so that you can, look into that. So, they've done what they could. And they were very interested in my work. But, it's hard, if you have in mind a narrative, it's hard to dislodge it. So, for instance, when I first brought up that painting, the first reaction, not in Albany, but in Saratoga was, oh, well, that didn't even happen, and that was because they were relying on the two most scholarly works. But there is no mention in the index, of enslavement or slavery. The author does a very credible job of reading the correspondence for what it is. And he definitely is aware that Schuyler was a slaveholder, but he just takes it for granted. It's naturalized. He doesn't interrogate those lives. So, they were sort of surprised, and then just the use of visual evidence that is not necessarily considered primary source. When we think of primary sources, we're thinking of sources from that period. But if Leutze is being told the story by a Schuyler descendant who heard the story from her mother, in the same way, Jeff Way, that in the Rhinebeck post office, the murals that show enslaved people, the WPA murals that show enslaved people as brick makers and dock workers was gotten from the memory of the collective, sort of generational memory of Franklin Roosevelt and Olin Dowes. And Roosevelt was instrumental in starting the Dutchess County Historical Society. They are channeling a history that was told to them and which they remember. And why would they tell it if, why would they just volunteer this information? They didn't have to paint that if it didn't happen, especially in the 30s. So visual evidence, ex post facto, if properly analyzed, can be very, very instructive. Okay.
Well, let's stay with that theme because the next couple of questions in the chat are about that. Christina commented that the actual Van Bergen Overmantel is at the Fenimore House in Cooperstown, if anyone wants to go visit it. And then there was another question in reference to the Van Bergen Overmantel. Was Heaton really painting what he saw or what his client wanted him to depict, i.e. reading the painting and other material culture with the same critical eye that you've been talking about using with your text sources?
Well, I think that, we don't know. That's the short answer. But what I would say is that any owner of that property would want a complimentary painting, and I do think that it makes sense to read it as a kind of idealized picture of a functioning, happily operating farmstead. So I mean, the horses look happy, everything seems happy, so to that extent, I'm sure he was sort of responding to a patron's wishes. But you read evidence against other evidence, so we know from extant tax records, there were provincial censuses that were intermittent that were taken, that here you have 3 enslaved people on a modest size farm, and that's accurate. So you have to be clever in how you read sources. You have to take them comprehensively. So in that sense, I think it was accurate. Was accurate in terms of projecting the ideals, but it was also accurate in reproducing the actual makeup of the farm force.
Maybe another in the back, sorry.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
My name is Sean Mark. I'm an artist and have directly benefited from Dr. Armstead's ongoing
And vice versa. We love each other.
The research, I heard you say something that I felt like I maybe hadn't heard you say before, so I just want to make sure that maybe I missed it or there's something there. When you said the distinction between a slave society and a society with slaves, it seemed like you were leaning on the idea that the Hudson Valley, this area that you're talking about, was maybe closer to a slave society. And I'm wondering if what you said about the way in which, and this is, I'm thinking specifically now about the painfully slow, gradual Emancipation Act over the course of, right? You can see, put the exact number of years on it, had to do with the way, with what you mentioned, the way in which politically, even perhaps well, let's say enfranchised white males were in this case beneficiaries
Oh, yeah.
of that slave society as you described it, which would explain why emancipation
Was so,
took so damn long.
yeah. No, there's no question about it. David Gelman, now he has 2 books on it. But the first book is, I think it's called Emancipation in New York, and it might have been published 10 years ago. I know, and then he has a new one. But the first one is painstaking. If you want to know what the state legislature did, every month, every day, to go to that book, and it's really clear that the Hudson River counties were the most recalcitrant. In the rest of the state, there was much more openness to manumission, period. So there was a negotiation that took place from about 1795 to the law in 1799, and then the provisions for, owners to post bonds that went back and forth for slaves that they were going to liberate in case they were indigent, in case they needed to, end up on the public dole, all of this slowed the process. Schuyler himself, I include this in the book, there is this one document, and it's sort of tantalizing because you can't get to the bottom line, but he writes to a key legislator, and he says, here I'm enclosing my version of what the bill should be. And he says, this would be far better for the slave owners. He literally says that. But what it was, we don't know. So he definitely, and he did not manumit, and I make this argument in the book, he did not manumit any of his slaves. It was all in his will, so he was dead. And so he didn't have to deal with it at all. He was buying and selling slaves, after 1799. So, yes.
I had a question. I'm reading another book, right in the middle of it now, talking about the escaped slave and her husband from the South. And they talk about one of the things you just mentioned in your last sentence about the buying and selling of slaves, the disregard for family bond within the slave, limitations on literacy, and limitations on getting into professions, whether it's brickmaker or some other kind of woodworking or stuff like that. And I think, was there any qualitative difference between life of an enslaved person in this area compared to an enslaved person in the entire life of Georgia, for example?
Well, I mean, there are lots of yeses and nos, but I'll just talk about provisions for emancipation. So one of the features of gradual emancipation in New York was that people who supported manumission, because they were so afraid of what the integration of or the absorption of newly freed Black people in this state would be like, what they were questioning, would it be viable? One of the provisions was for the education, the minimal education of free Black people. So I can't right this minute recall the precise stipulation, but for instance, I've looked at the records of Montgomery Place, which is a property that Bard bought, and in the records of Janet Livingston Montgomery, you see in the period, I think around after 1804, where she is basically leasing out young enslaved boys to someone else. And that's something that happens in manumission too. It sort of widens the opportunities to have access to enslaved labor by people who couldn't buy a slave, so they can lease that person for a few years. So one of the provisions is that when this young boy comes back, that he will have been provided a certain minimal number of years of literacy training, or to read and write. And the New York Manumission Society, it's well known, supported the Free African School in New York, which was part of that was all one parcel, a Free African School to teach basic literacy skills to this population that was going to be freed. So, there's no such thing like that in the South, because the South wasn't anticipating, any kind of manumission. There's a section in the book where I take on the characterization of slavery in this area as gentle treatment. There was a visitor, a Scottish woman who was a teenager in the 1760s, right before the hostilities between the colonists and the British really were enjoined. And she is the daughter of a military lieutenant or something in the British Army. And she and her mother and her family are somehow or another stationed in the Albany area, and they spend a lot of time at the Flats. You would know that, which was owned by Margarita Schuyler, who was the aunt of the general. And the book is wonderful for historians because she describes what she sees, and she has, quite a bit of useful information concerning her observations of Blacks and enslaved Blacks. And she says at one point that the institution is milder, and that there's complete understanding, between the enslaved population and the enslavers, and it's better. That's what she says, and I take that on in the book. So
I'm going to grab one from the chat. Have you been able to research the lives of any of the enslaved people?
Yes, I mean, it's hard, but that I felt was my charge. They don't leave records themselves. There are only official records in the Schuyler papers, but I'd like to give you an example of one that I found. I was going to the Schuyler papers. There are lots of them, thousands, right? And, at some point you don't know what, you don't know when to drift off, and when to, and how vigilant to remain, because it's just, you don't know what you're going to find. So this was a letter written in 1777 by the clothier general. That's the quartermaster, the guy who's in charge of getting supplies. Now, the revolutionaries had briefly gained control of Montreal. And so this quartermaster is saying to Schuyler, he's reporting what purchases he's made, because New York is occupied by the British. And so if you really want to get like nice imported things, you can now get them through Montreal. So he's saying, I got catgut and a gauze. And when I first read it, I was kind of in sort of an indifferent kind of reading mode. And I thought, okay, military supplies, catgut for the stitches and the gauze. And then towards the end, it said he kind of excuses the fact that he went over budget. And he says, I got a second carpet. It was just so fine. And I thought, a carpet? Well, the generals did have better supplies, maybe that's that. But then he says, and I had to exchange the wench for it. And then I thought, oh, no, the wench is an enslaved woman. And I'm thinking, really? And then he says, ultimately, so I've got to leave soon because they are going to discern her character. Intemperate, lazy, disobedient. And so in other words, this is somebody that they want to get rid of. They dumped her in exchange for this costly carpet. And that made me go back and read the letter again. And I found out, wait a minute, there's only one thing for sure that I can attribute to a military purchase, and that's the catgut and the nails, because the gauze apparently was very, very popular for women, and they used it in the Revolutionary War. And, for anyone who, questions that, the source of that information is a descendant of the Dutch who wrote this in 1903, before we had all these culture wars. So she had, she's just telling the truth, and so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, most of this was personal, and then he dumps this wench. So what is this telling me, A, about Schuyler? But what is that saying about this woman? Was she intemperate, lazy, and what was the other word? I can't remember. Disobedient. Now, lazy, intemperate. What does that mean? She's not working. She's obstinate or whatever. And, that could be a totally depressed, discouraged woman. She could have lost a child. There's other evidence that one of the Schuylers sired an illegitimate child, which I talk about, by a favorite Negro woman. Was she that person? We don't know. So you can start to imagine, from those little bits. Or in a letter, Diana ran away again. She's been hiding out there for 14 days with so-and-so. So you begin to sort of look at the larger circumstances and imagine. I'll give you one other example. So from the Canadian record, Scipio, the British, as you probably know, early on in the war, promised emancipation to enslaved people who would serve with them. It took the American a little bit longer. They didn't want to do that because they didn't want to destabilize the system and demoralize their fighters. It's a long story. There were many slaves who defected. I don't know if that's the word, but who ran away to the British. And the British evacuated with the Loyalists after the war. Many of them to Canada. And we know their precise destinations. I mean, that's been studied elsewhere. Many of the free Black communities in Canada have their origins there. But there was a record that was kept, and the short name of it is the Book of Negroes. That's what they called it. But that does exist. And I looked up, any Schuyler, runaways. And sure enough, there was this Scipio. And he ran away during the Revolutionary War. And he was, there was the name of the ship and where he landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And then, once I saw that, I kept going, he ran away, and I had all of this other evidence of fears of running away among the Albany whites during the war. So he did it. And so I went on and I found that a year later, there is a roster of free Blacks in that community. And one is an infant boy named Christopher Scipio. And, I don't know, but, if I wanted to, if I had all the time in the world, and Bill and I, we're talking about all these subjects that we could pursue now. I'd love to go up to Halifax and look for the Scipios and, to see if they have done, that research. So that tells you a lot about what was on this man's mind. Yeah. So, I mean, I could give many, many examples of how the evidence that just seems so cut and dry and lifeless, if interrogated properly, and read against other sources,
Right.
is revelatory.
Right. I just want to, I'll throw out there for anyone else who's interested in the Book of Names. There actually is a really good movie about it. I'm pretty sure you can get it on Netflix, but it's called The Book of Names The Book of Negroes. And it tells a lot about how those people lived after they got to Canada and how they got to Canada.
There was
So,
that one.
Yes, we
that's
can
been
take
waiting.
one last question, sir.
So 2 questions.
Two last questions.
Continental Army, I believe, formed up around the Capital District before the Battle of Saratoga. Do you have any idea how many people were involved with that?
No, I'm just going to say that. At some point in this research, I got really into trying to teach myself military history. And because I was really trying to address the concerns of, I was anticipating the concerns of the military historians against my claim that Schuyler did not want Blacks in the Army. And so I went overboard, and they wrote back to me and said, so I had the numbers at one point, but they're out of my head happily. And
approximately, you're not gonna have a whole.
I'm gonna say, you know what, I'm 7,000. I don't want to go on record as a historian saying the wrong thing. I will write to you. Or give you a source, but no, I honestly don't.
Okay, the other question is, I believe that slavery was actually outlawed in New York State. Is that true, and when?
1799 was the gradual abolition law, which said that if you're born after July 4th, 1799, very ironic, July 4th, as if that would be, something to celebrate. If you were female, by the time you were 25, you were free. And if 28, you were free if you were male. And then that was amended in 1817 to kind of make that hard and fast. So 1827.
1827?
Yes.
Can you tell when was the last enslaved person was actually freed?
It was like 40 something, 46 or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what comment.
Mhm.
You mentioned Schuyler Flats, and I'm sure you know that a number of years ago, the remains of a number of people that are assumed to be having been enslaved by the Schuylers were found, and the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany has a wonderful artwork that was made of the wooden cases that were made for each of the sets of remains that were later buried in Albany Rural Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and they actually, it's very interesting. 12,000 to 14,000 for you.
Oh,
That's your answer.
12 to 14,000 or thereabouts?
Yeah, yeah, or thereabouts on the American side.
Yeah, right.
Okay, just to follow up on your comment also, I was actually at Schuyler Mansion last year around Pinkster,
Mhm.
so in the spring, and they have a beautiful, when you first walk in, they've done these models of
Yes.
people's faces based on the bones that they found. So you can really get an idea of what their enslaved people look like, and they have their shoes and things like that. So it's worth a trip to go see that.
And there actually, it's on, there's a site where you can see some of that. You may have that. You may, I don't know, want to announce it, but you can actually see those on the web. And there's also a site in Manhattan that's done the same thing, where they've sort of reconstructed the actual body based on extant evidence.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Last question?
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. Last one, no more.
What did you learn about, were there any enslaved people, males probably, who were working in the occupation of sailor, maritime industry, were they, on the river? Were they- I'm interested because of Hudson and whaling history in particular.
Yeah, so Schuyler at Schuylerville in his operation shipped his materials down the river to Albany, then to New York. And the slaves were used as bateau men regularly. And even if they sometimes wanted something from Rhinebeck or, one of the settlements on the Hudson River, they would sometimes send an enslaved person down. So in my research, I was looking at the bateaumen who were enslaved and attached to the Schuylers. In Freedom, as you probably know, there is the famous Samuel Schuyler, who actually operated his own steamship line in the antebellum period. But we don't, obviously there is some tie to a Schuyler, but we don't know what that tie was. And it was a successful operation well into the 19th century. So bateaumen, and I actually have a visual of that in the book to emphasize that. So they were essential. I know that list of tasks that I read was tedious and you may have missed it, but boatmen. Yeah, they were very much involved in that.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're very
much.
welcome.
Love
Very
that.
welcome.
I hope everyone else enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Before we go, I do want to thank all of you who are here again, and thank everyone who joined us on Zoom as well.